Hey guys, it's been a little bit over a week since I released the mintyPi build guide. Already seeing a lot of people posting their build progress on Instagram and Facebook. It's really been fun to watch, but there have been a few common issues that people have been running into. So I wanted to put a video together to show you guys how to troubleshoot those issues and hopefully get past them. I'll get to that here in just a minute. I've got a few updates for you guys first. The first update is that Helder's custom parts are back in stock, so if you missed out on them the first time around, now's your chance to get them. There's a blog post that goes along with this video. Look in the description, there will be a link to it. I'll have links to where you can purchase these parts. I don't know how long they'll last, but as of the time of posting this video, they are in stock. And speaking of custom parts, I've also added a couple new color options for the 3D printed parts that I'm selling. I've got black, which goes really well with the licorice tins, which they actually don't make anymore, but you can still get the tins on eBay, so if you want to do a black build, that's a really cool option for you. I've also added transparent. I've got a build that uses the transparent here. It looks really nice. You can see through to the Raspberry Pi, you can see the lights, you can see the lights on the battery charger. This is actually one that I put together for Chris over at Pocket Legion. That guy's got probably the best handheld gaming collection I've ever seen. I have a link to his YouTube channel in the description below, so I'll be sending this over to him here in a couple of days, and he'll be doing a video about it, so definitely check out his channel and keep an eye out for that. And then this one actually isn't even out yet. This is a prototype that Helder sent me. This is a board that attaches to your button PCB. Really easy to connect. You just put some solder down in each of these holes. And so what this does, along with a script that Hoolyhoo from the forums wrote, it'll add a battery indicator to your screen just like your cell phone has. So you'll be able to keep an eye on your battery level while you play. It'll also warn you and automatically shut down if the battery is critically low. And then you also have the option with this to connect a couple of wires to a button that you mount somewhere on your mintyPi and have it automatically safely shut down your system. So you don't have to back out of your game and pull up the emulation station menu just to shut the system down safely. So really excited to check this out. I'm going to have a separate video that'll show how to hook it up, and I'll also have an updated version of the pre-made RetroPie image, so you'll be able to put that on your SD card and have all the software ready to go for this. But yeah, definitely keep an eye on the forums and on the pseudomod market for that to pop up. And the last thing that I want to mention by way of update is a giveaway. I had so many people asking me to do a giveaway for this like I did the Game Boy Zero. As I mentioned earlier, there's a blog post that goes along with this video. There will be an entry widget where you can enter by following me on things like Instagram, Facebook, subscribing on YouTube, all that good stuff. That's going to be going through the end of August, so head over there and enter and you'll have a chance to win one of these that I put together myself. And then there's actually a second giveaway being done by somebody on the forums. I'll also link to that in the blog post. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of the more common issues that I see people running into on the forums. The first, and by far the most common, people will get their board connected to the Raspberry Pi, they'll get their screen all connected, get their SD card ready, boot it up, but all they see is a white screen. These screens don't just work out of the box. You have to do some software setup to get them to work. You need to either be using the pre-made RetroPie image that I supplied, or start with a fresh RetroPie install and then run the setup script that I provided. You can also use the HDMI port to just connect your Raspberry Pi to a TV and make sure that it's even booting up, so you can rule out there being anything wrong with your SD card or the Raspberry Pi itself. So as long as your screen is getting power, you're going to get a white screen because that's just the backlight being turned on. And it'll stay white for the first, 15 seconds or so of it booting up. So if it goes past that and it's still white, then you've probably got something wrong. The most common reason for this is that you don't have a good connection between the GPIO pinholes and the pads that are underneath. So as I showed in the guide, take your multimeter and make sure that you have good continuity between each of these pinholes and the corresponding test pad. If you don't have a multimeter, it's going to be really hard to make sure that you have everything right. And they're not expensive. You don't need a very nice one for this. You could get one for under $10 easily. And if you run into some pinholes that you just cannot seem to get connected to the pad underneath it, one trick that I found works really well is to take a small piece of wire, preferably some thicker wire, tin it, and then heat it up and stick it down into whatever pinhole you're having troubles with. And just kind of work it around in there for a second. And I found that 9 out of 10 times, that'll fix it right there. It'll help the solder flow down onto the pad below it. Another thing to note is that as you make these connections and make sure that they're nice and solid, or as you try any of the other troubleshooting tips that I'm going to show here in a second, you will have to power cycle your Raspberry Pi. The Pi has to send some initialization commands to the screen itself to make it start working. And that happens right when the Raspberry Pi boots up. So if that's already happened, even if you fix the connection, the screen's still not going to work. So you need to turn it off, fix the connections, and then plug it back in and see if that fixed it. So once you make sure that you have a good connection between all the pinholes and the test pads, if you're still getting the white screen, Another cause of that can be that you haven't thickened up your ribbon cable enough, as I showed in the guide. The purpose of that is not just to make it harder to pull out accidentally, it's to make sure that the traces on this ribbon are pressed firmly against the pins inside this connector. And it isn't like a composite screen or something, it's all digital, so it's either going to work or it's not going to work at all. As I mentioned in the guide, you're going to have to trim off a tiny bit from each side to make it fit inside the connector. If you don't do that evenly on both sides, you may have these traces misaligned with the pins inside the connector. So that's another thing to check, is to look really closely and make sure that these are lined up with the pins. Helder has a whole thread on the forums that I'll link to that shows a good way to check and make sure that you have it lined up. So all that's for if your screen just stays white and you can't get anything else out of it. But if your screen isn't even turning white, as if the backlight isn't coming on, or if it does come on but it's extremely dim, another issue that's popped up a couple of times, in fact Helder made a thread about it because he ran into it, is a bad ground connection between this ribbon connector and the button PCB. I guess at the factory where these were assembled, a few of them went out that didn't have a really solid connection on that pin. What you can do is check the voltage between this VCC test pad and the ground test pad next to it. It should read 3.3 volts or very close to it. If it doesn't, if it's reading, 2 volts or something like that, what you can do is very carefully run a wire from this second pin here to this ground test pad to ensure that it has a good ground connection. So again, that's for if you have a really dim backlight or a backlight that doesn't come on at all. I've only seen that pop up a couple of times on the forums, but it's worth mentioning. Another issue that I've seen brought up a few times is people saying that their buttons catch as they push them down, or if they push them down all the way, they wind up twisting and getting stuck. I went over this in the guide, but I can't stress enough how important it is to file these down and make sure that they're as smooth as you can possibly get them, as well as each of these corners here, to make sure that you have a nice smooth surface for those buttons to rub against. The other thing that you can do is very gently take a file to the edge all the way around these buttons, just to make sure that that surface is as smooth as possible as well. But don't over-file it, or you'll end up with buttons that are allowed to spin around inside the button wells. And as for the buttons twisting around when you push them in all the way, you want to make sure that your button PCB is screwed nice and tightly against the 3D printed part, because what happens is if it's not nice and tight, then when you push the button in all the way, it creates a tiny bit of a gap so that the button is allowed to spin around in there. But don't go crazy with that, because if you tighten it too much, you'll wind up stripping some of these screw holes or having the screw poke into this side, making a little bulge where the screw hole is. So again, make sure they're nice and tight, and that should solve the issue of the buttons spinning around in there. It's also worth mentioning that if you have any buttons that aren't working very well after you get everything set up, the first thing that you should check is making sure that you have a good connection between whichever GPIO pinhole goes to that button and the corresponding test pad. You should also make sure that these contacts here are nice and clean. You can use some isopropyl alcohol to clean them off, and that your button membranes are nice and clean as well. Alright guys, well I think that about covers it for now. I thought it would be fun to show all the different versions of the mintyPi, from the very first endearingly ugly version that I did up through this latest one. If you're putting a mintyPi together, be sure and stop by the forums if you get stuck or if you need help, or if you just want to show off your progress. And again, be sure and check out the blog post that goes along with this video, where you'll be able to enter to win your own mintyPi that I put together myself. And stay tuned for more updates and some new projects coming up soon. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.